here's a great example of a question where you just need to know yourself, okay? This is about circles. And in order to find the center of the circle, we're going to need to know the circle formula. And unlike something like y equals mx plus b, the circle formula just doesn't come up very often on the SAT or in regular math. So it's not something that's as easily accessible. On top of that, in order to turn this into the circle formula, we're going to need to know how to complete the square. And that is something that you learned, I guarantee it, in school at some point, and you took the quiz on it, and then you completely forgot about it. It's a mathematical dead end, right? It comes up occasionally, things like vertexes and parabolas, circles. So it comes up occasionally, but it's not very useful in the big picture, and so it's easy to forget. And so if you don't know the circle formula or how to complete the square, this is a good example. Pick your favorite letter, move on. Don't waste time trying to figure this out. You're not going to be able to do it. There's easier points to come in the grid-ins. So I want you to lock in those points instead of worrying about this random thing where, you also have a 25% chance of getting lucky and guessing right. So I'll show you how to do it, but it's okay to skip questions. You don't need to get everything. So we do need to memorize some stuff for this. So let's start with the overall formula for a circle. X minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. So hk is the center. So that tells us what we need to look for. Now, one little trick you might use here to increase your odds if you're guessing is you might see that, okay, if I know that this formula exists, even if I don't know how to get it, I might notice there's a 20 and a 16 here. Now, that is not the reason to pick them, right? If anything, that's the reason not to pick them, because this is supposed to be a very hard, time-consuming question, or at least hard. So is it really going to be the case that the numbers just that are sitting there are the answer? Probably not, right? That's a little too easy for something that's the second to last question kind of in the section, right? The second to hardest question here. So that increases your odds to now a 50-50 chance if you just kind of sense the difficulty and know that those answers, A and D, are a little too easy. We're going to need to do some conversion to turn this thing that has no parentheses into something that does. So here's how we complete the square. We're going to need to do it twice. We're going to need to do it once for the x and once for the y. So let's do it piece by piece. First, we take the x squared plus 20x, and we're going to need to create a situation where we have the perfect factors. So you know how when you factor and you make those little parentheses things? That's what we're doing, but we're doing it in such a way that the sets of parentheses are exactly the same. So there's a special way that that's going to come about. Basically, you take, how can I write this? 1/2 of b, so the b term in any quadratic is the one that's attached to the x, so that's 1/2 of 20, and you square it. So 1/2 of 20 is 10, and we add that in, and then we square it and we add that in, so that's 100. Okay? So what happens? Now think about factoring, right? Now if we were normally factoring, just without realizing the shortcut here, if we were normally factoring, we'd say, oh, okay, I need a number that multiplies to 100 and adds to 20. What does that? Well, 10 and 10, right? 10 and 10 multiply to 100 and add to 20. So notice it's the same number. We found a squared number. And so the factored form would be, I'm going to write it out the long way, x plus 10 times x plus 10, but we can shorten that because x plus 10 times x plus 10 is just x plus 10 squared. So now notice this is looking a lot like this. And if we know the formula, we're literally done at this point because it's only going to mean that one answer can be right. So the formula has this negative built in, which means that when we see it with numbers, the actual center is going to be the reverse sign of what's there. It's kind of like, again, we factor and we know that this x, the x is going to equal -10. It's kind of what's happening here. So the h is going to be negative 10, because what we're really doing here, I'm going to put it off to the side, is kind of like x minus negative 10 squared. And so when we plug in the negative 10, it becomes a positive 10, and that's why it looks the way it does for us. But this is why it's a hard question. There's just, not only is the stuff hard to memorize, but it's also kind of confusing, even if you do memorize it. So that negative 10 is going to force our hand. It's going to make us pick B. I'm going to finish building this circle equation just because some of you might need a little refresher on complete the square and how this works, but that's all I would do normally. I'd be done with the question. I would move on to number 30. So I don't want you to think you have to do the rest of this. But here's what I would do is I would then say, okay, that's the x part. Let's do the y's. So the y is going to be y squared plus 16y. And we do the same thing. So, right, we're going to take half of b, b over 2 squared. So 16 divided by 2 is 8. 8 squared is 64. And now when I factor, right, I would need numbers that multiply to 8, or multiply to 64 and add to 16. And the number that does that is positive 8. And so, should be y. Y plus 8 squared is the completed square version of what we started with. So now that gets us to, if we started combining these, let's use red, x plus 10 squared plus y plus 8 squared equals, well, before it was negative 20. But it's not going to be negative 20 anymore. And this is a hard thing that people forget when they complete the square, is I did a bad thing mathematically. I randomly added 164 to an equation. You can't do that. You can't randomly add numbers to things. So if I add something on the left side, I need to balance it out by adding it on the right. So that negative 20, I'll put it over here still, is going to get an extra 100 and an extra 64 to balance out what I added on the left. So this is the thing is, in math, where you can't change something randomly, right? Sometimes we always have balance. And so like when we change a fraction, it's because we're doing something on the top and on the bottom, right? If we're moving something across an equation, we're adding it to one side and adding it to the other for balance. And so we're doing the same thing here. We added 100 and a 64 onto the left side of this equation because we needed those numbers to create this very special situation where we could complete the square and factor. So in order to do that, though, we need to account for it on the other side, right? There needs to be a balance. And so once we add those, we're going to change that value on the right. And so this part still is as simple as it's going to get. But now this is going to be 144. And so reading this, I'm kind of on different parts here, but the center of this equation would be negative 10, negative 8, which is what we found as the answer, so it's there. And then the radius is going to be 12, right? Because look at what we started with. R squared is what's on the right side. So it's not going to look like it because if we have a number, it's not going to have a square next to it. But in this case, the square root of 144 is 12, and so that's the radius. So it's a lot. It's a lot. And sometimes you will have a question that does require you to do all of this. We had this little escape hatch at the top, but not every question is going to have that. So if you do, really want to get an 800, you're going to need to know how to do this and how to be thorough with it and not make mistakes. So it's a difficult concept. Luckily, it doesn't come up that often. For most of you, even when it does, you can skip it. But for some of you who are really looking for that high score, hopefully my explanation here gave you the material to be able to do this again on your own. It's definitely something you can practice on Khan Academy if you want. I'm sure just type in complete the square or circle formula and you'll get questions about it. It's good to, memorize.